New updates in the Sean Diddy Combs legal saga. The rap mogul gets an official sentencing date. He gets hit with allegations from a shocking new lawsuit. A juror speaks out, and also, apparently, Diddy receives a standing ovation from inmates.
The room was cold, but not the kind of cold you feel on your skin. This was the kind of cold that sank deep, settling in your bones, making the air heavy, almost unbreathable. Every person seated in that courtroom knew they were about to witness something irreversible. Diddy sat at the defense table.
But I'll tell you what, this case, not over. No. Important hearing today, sort of. We got to talk about why. Well, Judge Arun Subramanian had sent a tentative October 3rd sentencing date for Diddy on his convictions of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. Remember, that's what he was convicted of. He was acquitted of racketeering conspiracy, and he was acquitted of the 2 sex trafficking counts. But he was convicted of these prostitution charges. And at one point, there was reporting that defense counsel for Sean Combs and prosecutors, they had then agreed to switch the date to September 22nd. And we thought, okay, because today's hearing was supposed to be about expediting the October hearing. Then they agreed to September 22nd. Now apparently it's back to October 3rd. This is all over the place. Very confusing. We'll get it straightened out. I gotta say it's interesting because Combs' defense counsel had originally stated last week when it was the October 3rd date that they wanted that sentencing expedited, meaning they wanted it to happen sooner. And one of the things that Sean Combs' attorney, Mark Agnifilo, had said was, quote, the mother of some of his children had passed away many years ago. These kids, the 2 daughters here sitting in the middle of Your Honor's second row, don't have a parent. Obviously referring to the death of Kim Porter in 2018, mother of Christian, Jesse, Delilah, Quincy. And by the way, remember Sean Combs was denied bail, so it wasn't even like he got to go home after the verdict. But clearly they wanted this expedited. They want his sentencing to happen as quickly as possible. They want him out of jail. They want him out of prison as soon as possible. And also it's interesting because prosecutors, they need time for the pre-sentencing investigation and report. Basically, that's when a probation officer interviews the defendant, looks at the history, the background, childhood, education, employment, criminal history, finances, the mental and physical health of the defendant. There are interviews that are conducted with family and friends. The officer looks at various court and school records, employment records, financial records. The officer could speak to the victims in the case, law enforcement that were involved in the investigation, provide all of this information in a report to the judge, because here the judge is going to have a lot of discretion when it comes to the sentence. What could a sentence look like? Well, prosecutors indicated in a filing that before even doing a pre-sentencing investigation, Combs is looking at 51 to 63 months, a little over 4 to 5 years in prison. The defense seems to be pushing for 21 to 27 months, so a little over 1.5 to 2 years. But remember, Combs has been sitting in federal lockup since September at the MDC, so if he gets time served, he really wouldn't be spending that much time behind bars. Now, of course, they're the extremes. When you talk about transportation to engage in prostitution, the maximum for each count is 10 years in prison. You stack them together, you get 20 years. Okay, based upon the facts in this case, it seems highly unlikely he would get that much. Other side, you get the idea. There's no minimum for this charge. So could he get time served and walk free? Also seems unlikely, in that you're dealing with multiple instances of transporting Jane and Cassie, the 2 victims in this case, and
not in the tailored suits and diamond chains the world was used to seeing, but in a muted, conservative outfit chosen by his legal team to soften his image. The man who had once commanded stages, red carpets, and billion-dollar boardrooms now looked like just another defendant waiting for judgment. But even stripped of the glamour, the air around him was thick with the weight of his name, his legacy, and the empire that was now trembling at its foundation. 4 months. This case had been a slow-moving earthquake. Rumors had been swirling long before the charges were made public. Whispers about deals gone wrong, about private meetings in shadowy corners, about people who had stories but were too scared, or too well compensated, to speak them aloud. The tabloids painted him as a man under siege. His team painted him as a victim of a smear campaign. But in this room, those narratives didn't matter. All that mattered were the facts, the evidence, and the words about to come out of the judge's mouth. The judge, An older man with a steady voice and a face carved from years of delivering hard truths, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him. The pause before he spoke was almost cruel and
saw during the trial, even a number of the witnesses that they had always planned to call that they did put in kind of blew up in their faces or had positive things to say about Sean that maybe they weren't anticipating. And so it would have been pretty risky for them to put Christina Coram on the stand, I think.
There was so much being said about your client in that trial, obviously in the media, facing a number of different lawsuits. We also wondered whether or not he, and it's his decision alone, whether he wanted to take the stand and give his story, tell his story, give his version of events. Obviously, there are a ton of risks that come with putting a defendant on the stand, but it would be his choice. Was there a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, I can't get into, attorney-client privilege
Sure,
conversations. Obviously he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news, some of the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made. But I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion, because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent? Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off. And I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie.
Its length. In that silence, you could hear the faint shuffle of papers, the clicking of pens, the muffled cough from the back row. Reporters leaned forward, hands poised above their notebooks, ready to capture every word. Diddy didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the judge, his posture locked. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing the next few sentences will define the rest of your life. When the judge began to speak, the room seemed to shrink. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that demanded attention. He recapped the case, not in the broad strokes the media had used, but in the fine, unflinching detail that had been presented during the trial: the financial records, the testimony from former associates, the accounts of lavish private events where the guest lists were as secretive as the activities within, the intimidation tactics allegedly used to keep certain voices quiet. Each point landed like a hammer strike, not just on the legal arguments, but on the carefully crafted image Diddy had built over decades. As the judge laid out the disturbing details,
there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what, that's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door.
Mm.
It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict does not is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he can say, look, I was once an abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR so that way, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn? Or
You could see subtle changes in Diddy's expression. He didn't explode, didn't shout, but his jaw tightened. His eyes darted slightly as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. For years, he had been the man in control, the man who could spin a bad headline into a marketing opportunity. But here, spin meant nothing. The sentencing came next. The judge's words were clinical, almost detached, but the impact was anything but. The number of years was not a suggestion, it was a command from the state. A declaration that the man who had once seemed untouchable would now be confined within walls he couldn't buy his way out of. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some were from onlookers who had believed, right up until that moment, that his wealth and influence would shield him from the full force of the law. Others were from those who had followed every twist of the trial and still couldn't believe it had come to this. Diddy's reaction was not theatrical, but it was powerful in its quietness. His shoulders slumped, the faintest exhale slipping from his lips. His hands, resting on the table, curled slightly, knuckles whitening. It wasn't the look of a man angry at injustice. It was the look of a man realizing the reality he had tried to outrun had
That he was convicted of, which are the Mann Act violations. Can he aggravate those when he was acquitted of the more serious charges, essentially acquitted of everything that involved violence, threats, all of that sort of thing? So
Right.
it's a very, very interesting legal question.
Real quick, asset forfeiture. What is that exactly? How would it work with Mann Act convictions?
I just don't see the feds having it being on very strong ground to seize a bunch of assets. And here's why, Jesse. Most of the federal cases where you have, especially RICO cases, an actual RICO case is an actual corrupt organization that the purpose is, like I had one in Salt Lake City last year. It was a fraud case where it was one of these calling room scam operations. Every dollar that they made in that, they made out of the bank account of some poor innocent victim who got scooped up in their scheme. So every dollar, everything they bought, every car, every house, everything that they owned was a direct result of money that they gleaned from innocent people. Those are the cases, or narcotics. We see this all the time in narcotics cases where but it's the same principle. All the things that they have are a result of narcotics profits, right? So when you look at one of those cases, you're seizing assets. Here we've got mansions all over the place. We've got planes. This is a very, very wealthy man who made that money legitimately in Bad Boy Records, in the music industry and in the film industry. That's how he made his money, and that is not a product. And that's where we come full circle to this square peg and a round hole regarding a RICO theory on this. The money, he didn't make any money from the freak-offs. He didn't make any money from all of the alleged things he did. He didn't make any money from that horrible video that we saw where he's beating Cassie in that hotel. That's not the source of his income. So I think, again, I don't think that the feds or even the court, I don't think the court would look kindly on that. And there's an old adage in the law that you and I've talked about before. Bad facts make bad law, right? And if they run around and try to seize a bunch of stuff based on this, they're literally taking assets from a citizen that earned them legally. He may be a villain, he may be a bully, he may be a horrible person, but he made that money legally. He was not charged here with tax fraud, which means he paid taxes on it. He had accountants, he put it all together. So I don't see this judge. I think it'd be a very poor move if they try to take a bunch of his stuff. I think that they still have to create a nexus between the Mann Act violations and his property, and I just don't see it.
I don't see it. Okay, well, he might need the money. Why? Because he's got a plethora of civil lawsuits that he's facing now. By the way, in fact, Tenny Garagos had something to say about that yesterday.
Sean Combs has not sexually assaulted anybody. I've been saying this for months. We've said it with each lawsuit that came out, and today that was proven true. The media got it wrong about Sean Combs every single day for nearly 2 years. I ask that for every time you guys see a civil lawsuit, criminal complaints or criminal indictments, you actually take a look and analyze these and see whether or not these are actually going to stand up in a court of law, because today they did not.
So Sean Combs, he is facing dozens of sexual assault lawsuits. In fact, Vulture recently clocked it at 66 women, men, minors, drugging, sexual assault, violence.
Finally caught him. For the first time in decades, he looked small. The judge didn't stop with the sentence. He detailed the reasoning behind it, going point by point through the evidence, outlining the patterns of behavior that had convinced the court this was not an isolated incident, but a sustained abuse of power. There were transactions that had no legitimate business explanation, communications that hinted at manipulation, and a web of connections that painted a picture of influence used not for art or opportunity, but for control and intimidation. These revelations hadn't been fully visible to the public before. Hearing them now, in the stark language of the court, stripped away any remaining illusion. As the judge spoke, Diddy's lawyers sat stone-faced, occasionally jotting notes but otherwise motionless. They knew the fight wasn't over. There would be appeals, motions, strategies, but they also knew this was a loss they could not spin into a win. Across the aisle, the prosecution team remained calm, their expressions unreadable. They didn't gloat. They didn't need to. The verdict spoke for itself. The atmosphere was so tense it felt like the air itself might shatter. When the judge finished, there was no dramatic bang of the gavel, just a quiet, deliberate closing of the file in front of him. That sound was almost louder than the sentence itself. It was the sound of finality. Diddy sat there for a moment longer, as if rooted to the spot. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward his legal team. They leaned in, whispering, but whatever they said didn't seem to reach him. His gaze drifted downward, to the polished wood of the defense table, and stayed there. This was not the image he had ever wanted the world to see, the image of a man stripped of the armor of fame, facing the raw, unfiltered consequences of his actions. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. The moment word of the sentence broke, the crowd erupted. Some shouted in disbelief, defending him as a victim of a biased system. Others cheered, seeing this as long overdue justice. News crews jostled for position, microphones in hand, desperate to grab
racketeering, and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a significant issue at the MDC related to the safety of employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action from multiple agencies to address. Importantly, MDC, as a jail, has a significant law enforcement presence within its walls 24 hours per day that are equipped with investigatory and often unregulated authority. Thus, the requirement of outside law enforcement agencies to ensure safety within the MDC is an admission that serious violence, mayhem, and chaos is occurring within the MDC that requires more than a Band-Aid raid, but rather surgery. Indeed, we are aware of ongoing threats of violence and actual violence in the facility such that Mr. Combs' safety is constantly at risk. And they go on to argue
sound bites from anyone connected to the case. Within minutes, social media was ablaze. Hashtags trended worldwide. Memes popped up almost instantly. Supporters and critics clashed in comment sections, each convinced they knew the truth. Inside the music industry, the ripples were immediate. Partnerships quietly dissolved. Endorsement deals vanished. Artists who had once called him a mentor or collaborator began to remove old photos and videos from their feeds. The brand that had been synonymous with success, style, and swagger was now radioactive. In a business where image is currency, Diddy's had plummeted overnight. For decades, he had been the master of reinvention. No matter what scandal came his way, he had always found a way to emerge not just unscathed, but stronger. But this was different. This wasn't a PR problem. This was a legal reality, and in the cold light of the courtroom, the myth of the untouchable mogul had been dismantled piece by piece. As he was escorted out, the cameras outside captured him for the first time since the sentence was announced. The man who once walked red carpets like they were runways now moved under the watch of law enforcement, each step a reminder that he no longer set the terms. The crowd's noise swelled, a chaotic mix of jeers, shouts of support, and the constant clicking of camera shutters. This wasn't just a sentence, it was a statement. It told every other power player in the industry that the old rules, the ones that let money and influence bend the system, were starting to crack. It told the world that even the biggest names could fall, and when they did, it wouldn't be quiet. For Diddy, The path forward was now a narrow one, dictated not by contracts or creative projects, but by the structure and limits of the prison system. His empire would run without him, if it ran at all, and every day behind those walls would be a reminder of this moment. The day the judge spoke, the world listened, and everything changed.